Prologue of At the Earth's Core. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. At the Earth's Core by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Prologue. In the first place, please bear in mind that I do not expect you to believe this story. Nor could you wonder had you witnessed a recent experience of mine when, in the armor of blissful and stupendous ignorance, I gaily narrated the gist of it to a fellow of the Royal Geological Society on the occasion of my last trip to London. You would surely have thought that I had been detected in no less a heinous crime than the purloining of the crown jewels from the Tower, or putting poison in the coffee of His Majesty the King. The erudite gentleman in whom I confided congealed before I was half through. It is all that saved him from exploding, and my dreams of an honorary fellowship, gold medals, and a niche in the Hall of Fame faded into the thin, cold air of his Arctic atmosphere. But I believe this story, and so would you, and so would the learned fellow of the Royal Geological Society, had you and he heard it from the lips of the man who told it to me. Had you seen, as I did, the fire of truth in those gray eyes? Had you felt the ring of sincerity in that quiet voice? Had you realized the pathos of it all, you too would believe. You would not have needed the final ocular proof that I had, the weird Rhamphorhynchus-like creature which he had brought back with him from the inner world. I came upon him quite suddenly, and no less unexpectedly, upon the rim of the great Sahara Desert. He was standing before a goatskin tent amidst a clump of date palms within a tiny oasis. Close by was an Arab douar of some 8 or 10 tents. I had come down from the north to hunt lion. My party consisted of a dozen children of the desert. I was the only white man. As we approached the little clump of verdure, I saw the man come from his tent with hand-shielded eyes, peer intently at us. At the sight of me he advanced rapidly to meet us. "A white man!" he cried. "May the good Lord be praised. I have been watching you for hours, hoping against hope that this time there would be a white man. Tell me the date. What year is it?" And when I had told him, he staggered, as though he had been struck full in the face, so that he was compelled to grasp my stirrup leather for support. "It cannot be," he cried after a moment. "It cannot be! Tell me that you were mistaken, or that you were but joking." "I am telling you the truth, my friend," I replied. "Why should I deceive a stranger, or attempt to, in so simple a matter as the date?" For some time he stood in silence, with bowed head. "10 years," he murmured at last. 10 years. And I thought that at most it could be scarce more than 1. That night he told me his story, the story that I give you here as nearly in his own words as I can recall them. End of prologue. Chapter 1 of At the Earth's Core. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. At the Earth's Core by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 1 Toward the Eternal Fires. I was born in Connecticut about 30 years ago. My name is David Innes. My father was a wealthy mine owner. When I was 19 he died. All his property was to be mine when I had attained my majority, provided that I had devoted the 2 years intervening in close application to the great business I was to inherit. I did my best to fulfill the last wishes of my parent, not because of the inheritance, but because I loved and honored my father. For 6 months I toiled in the mines and in the counting rooms, for I wished to know every minute detail of the business. Then Perry interested me in his invention. He was an old fellow who had devoted the better part of a long life to the perfection of a mechanical subterranean prospector. As relaxation, he studied paleontology. I looked over his plans, listened to his arguments, inspected his working model, and then, convinced, I advanced the funds necessary to construct a full-sized practical prospector. I shall not go into the details of its construction. It lies out there in the desert now, about 2 miles from here. Tomorrow you may care to ride out and see it. Roughly, it is a steel cylinder 100 feet long, and jointed so that it may turn and twist through solid rock if need be. At one end is a mighty revolving drill operated by an engine which Perry said generated more power to the cubic inch than any other engine did to the cubic foot. I remember that he used to claim that that invention alone would make us fabulously wealthy. We were going to make the whole thing public after the successful issue of our first secret trial. But Perry never returned from that trial trip, and I only after 10 years. I recall as it were but yesterday the night of that momentous occasion upon which we were to test the practicality of that wondrous invention. It was near midnight when we repaired to the lofty tower in which Perry had constructed his iron mole, as he was wont to call the thing. The great nose rested upon the bare earth of the floor. We passed through the doors into the outer jacket, secured them, and then passed on into the cabin, which contained the controlling mechanism within the inner tube, switched on the electric lights. Perry looked to his generator, to the great tanks that held the life-giving chemicals with which he was to manufacture fresh air to replace that which we consumed in breathing, to his instruments, for recording temperature, speed, distance, and for examining the materials through which we were to pass. He tested the steering device, and overlooked the mighty cogs which transmitted its marvelous velocity to the giant drill at the nose of his strange craft. Our seats, into which we strapped ourselves, were so arranged upon transverse bars that we would be upright whether the craft were plowing her way downward into the bowels of the earth, or running horizontally along some great seam of coal, or rising vertically towards the surface again. At length all was ready. Perry bowed his head in prayer. For a moment we were silent, and then the old man's hand grasped the starting lever. There was a frightful roaring beneath us. The giant frame trembled and vibrated. There was a rush of sound, as the loose earth passed up through the hollow space between the inner and outer jackets, to be deposited in our wake. We were off. The noise was deafening. The sensation was frightful. For a full minute neither of us could do aught but cling with that proverbial desperation of the drowning man to the handrails of our swinging seats. Then Perry glanced at the thermometer. "Gad!" he cried. "It cannot be possible. Quick! What does the distance meter read?" That and the speedometer were both on my side of the cabin, and as I turned to take a reading from the former I could see Perry muttering, 10 degrees rise! It cannot be possible! And then I saw him tug frantically upon the steering wheel. As I finally found the tiny needle in the dim light, I translated Perry's evident excitement, and my heart sank within me. But when I spoke I hid the fear which haunted me. "It will be 700 feet, Perry," I said, "by the time you can turn her into the horizontal." "You'd better give me a hand then, my boy," he replied, "for I cannot budge her out of the vertical alone. God give that our combined strength may be equal to the task, for else we are lost." I wormed my way to the old man's side with never a doubt but that the great wheel would yield on the instant to the power of my young and vigorous muscles. Nor was my belief mere vanity. for always had my physique been the envy and despair of my fellows, and for that very reason it had waxed even greater than nature had intended, since my natural pride in my great strength had led me to care for and develop my body and my muscles by every means within my power. What with boxing, football, and baseball, I had been in training since childhood. And so it was with the utmost confidence that I laid hold of the huge iron rim. But though I threw every ounce of my strength into it, my best effort was as unavailing as Perry's had been. The thing would not budge, the grim, insensate, horrible thing that was holding us upon the straight road to death. At length I gave up the useless struggle, and without a word returned to my seat. There was no need for words, at least none that I could imagine, unless Perry desired to pray. And I was quite sure that he would, for he never left an opportunity neglected where he might sandwich in a prayer. He prayed when he arose in the morning, he prayed before he ate, he prayed when he had finished eating, and before he went to bed at night he prayed again. In between he often found excuses to pray, even when the provocation seemed far-fetched to my worldly eyes. Now that he was about to die, I felt positive that I should witness a perfect orgy of prayer, if one may allude with such a simile to so solemn an act. But to my astonishment I discovered that with death staring him in the face, Abner Perry was transformed into a new being. From his lips there flowed not prayer, but a clear and limpid stream of undiluted profanity, and it was all directed at that quietly stubborn piece of unyielding mechanism. "I should think, Perry," I chided, "that a man of your professed religiousness would rather be at his prayers than cursing in the presence of imminent death." "Death!" he cried. "Death is it that appalls you? That is nothing by comparison with the loss the world must suffer. Why, David, within this iron cylinder we have demonstrated possibilities that science has scarce dreamed. We have harnessed a new principle, and with it animated a piece of steel with the power of 10,000 men. That 2 lives will be snuffed out is nothing to the world calamity that entombs in the bowels of the earth the discoveries that I have made and proved in the successful construction of the thing that is now carrying us farther and farther towards the eternal central fires." I am frank to admit that, for myself, I was much more concerned with our own immediate future than with any problematic loss which the world might be about to suffer. The world was at least ignorant of its bereavement, while to me it was a real and terrible actuality. "What can we do?" I asked, hiding my perturbation beneath the mask of a low and level voice. "We may stop here and die of asphyxiation when our atmospheric tanks are empty," replied Perry, "or we may continue on with the slight hope that we may later sufficiently deflect the prospector from the vertical to carry us along the arc of a great circle which must eventually return us to the surface. If we succeed in doing so before we reach the higher internal temperatures, we may even yet survive. There would seem to me to be about 1 chance in several million that we shall succeed. Otherwise we shall die more quickly, but no more surely than as though we sat supinely waiting for the torture of a slow and horrible death." I glanced at the thermometer. It registered 110 degrees. While we were talking the mighty iron mole had bored its way over a mile into the rock of the earth's crust. "Let us continue on, then," I replied. "It should soon be over at this rate. You never intimated that the speed of this thing would be so high, Perry. Didn't you know it?" "No," he answered. "I could not figure the speed exactly, for I had no instrument for measuring the mighty power of my generator. I reasoned, however, that we should make about 500 yards an hour." "And we are making 7 miles an hour," I concluded for him, as I sat with my eyes upon the distance meter. "How thick is the earth's crust, Perry?" I asked. "There are almost as many conjectures to that as there are geologists," was his answer. "One estimate is 30 miles, because the internal heat, increasing at a rate of about 1 degree to each 60 or 70 feet depth, would be sufficient to fuse the most refractory substance at that distance beneath the earth. Another finds that the phenomenon of precession and nutation require that the earth, if not entirely solid, must at least have a shell not less than 800 to 1,000 miles in thickness. So there you are. You may take your choice. And if it should prove solid? I asked. It will all be the same to us in the end, David, replied Perry. At the best, our fuel will suffice to carry us but 3 or 4 days, while our atmosphere cannot last to exceed 3. Neither, then, is sufficient to bear us in safety through 8,000 miles of rock to the antipodes. If the crust is of sufficient thickness, we shall come to a final stop between 600 and 700 miles beneath the earth's surface. But during the last 150 miles of our journey we shall be corpses, am I correct? I asked. Quite correct, David. Are you frightened? I do not know. It has all come so suddenly that I scarce believe that either of us realizes the real terrors of our position. I feel that I should be reduced to panic, but yet I am not. I imagine that the shock has been so great as to partially stun our sensibilities. Again I turned to the thermometer. The mercury was rising with less rapidity. It was now but 140 degrees, although we had penetrated to a depth of nearly 4 miles. I told Perry, and he smiled. We have shattered one theory at least, was his only comment, and then he returned to his self-assumed occupation of fluently cursing the steering wheel. I once heard a pirate swear, but his best efforts would have seemed like those of a tyro alongside of Perry's masterful and scientific imprecations. Once more I tried my hand at the wheel, but I might as well have essayed to swing the earth itself. At my suggestion Perry stopped the generator, and as we came to rest I again threw all my strength into a supreme effort to move the thing even a hair's breadth, but the results were as barren as when we had been traveling at top speed. I shook my head sadly and motioned to the starting lever. Perry pulled it toward him, and once again we were plunging downward toward eternity at a rate of 7 miles an hour. I sat with my eyes glued to the thermometer and the distance meter. The mercury was rising very slowly now, though even at 145 degrees it was almost unbearable within the narrow confines of our metal prison. About noon, or 12 hours after our start upon this unfortunate journey, we had bored to a depth of 84 miles, at which point the mercury registered 153 degrees Fahrenheit. Perry was becoming more hopeful, although upon what meager food he sustained his optimism I could not conjecture. From cursing he had turned to singing. I felt that the strain had at last affected his mind. For several hours we had not spoken except as he asked me for the readings of the instruments from time to time, and I announced them. My thoughts were filled with vain regrets. I recalled numerous acts of my past life, which I should have been glad to have had a few more years to live down. There was the affair in the Latin Commons at Andover, when Calhoun and I had put gunpowder in the stove and nearly killed one of the masters. And then, but what was the use? I was about to die, and atone for all these things and several more. Already the heat was sufficient to give me a foretaste of the hereafter. A few more degrees and I felt that I should lose consciousness. What are the readings now, David? Perry's voice broke in upon my somber reflections. 90 miles and 153 degrees, I replied. Gad, but we've knocked that 30-mile crust theory into a cocked hat, he cried gleefully. Precious lot of good it'll do us, I growled back. But my boy, he continued, doesn't that temperature reading mean anything to you? Why, it hasn't gone up in 6 miles. Think of it, son. Yes, I'm thinking of it, I answered. But what difference will it make when our air supply is exhausted, whether the temperature is 153 degrees or 153,000? We'll be just as dead, and no one will know the difference anyhow. But I must admit that for some unaccountable reason, the stationary temperature did renew my waning hope. What I hoped for I could not have explained, nor did I try. The very fact, as Perry took pains to explain, of blasting several very exact and learned scientific hypotheses made it apparent that we could not know what lay before us within the bowels of the earth, and so we might continue to hope for the best, at least until we were dead, when hope would no longer be essential to our happiness. It was very good and logical reasoning, and so I embraced it. At 100 miles the temperature had dropped to 152.5 degrees. When I announced it, Perry reached over and hugged me. From then on until noon of the second day, it continued to drop until it became as uncomfortably cold as it had been unbearably hot before. At the depth of 240 miles, our nostrils were assailed by almost overpowering ammonia fumes, and the temperature had dropped to 10 below zero. We suffered nearly 2 hours of this intense and bitter cold, until at about 245 miles from the surface of the earth we entered a stratum of solid ice, when the mercury quickly rose to 32 degrees. During the next 3 hours we passed through 10 miles of ice, eventually emerging into another series of ammonia impregnated strata, where the mercury again fell to 10 degrees below zero. Slowly it rose once more until we were convinced that at last we were nearing the molten interior of the earth. At 400 miles the temperature had reached 153 degrees. Feverishly I watched the thermometer. Slowly it rose. Perry had ceased singing and was at last praying. Our hopes had received such a death blow that the gradually increasing heat seemed to our distorted imaginations much greater than it really was. For another hour I saw that pitiless column of mercury rise and rise until at 410 miles it stood at 153 degrees. Now it was that we began to hang upon those readings in almost breathless anxiety. 153 degrees had been the maximum temperature above the ice stratum. Would it stop at this point again, or would it continue its merciless climb? We knew there was no hope, and yet with the persistence of life itself we continued to hope against practical certainty. Already the air tanks were at low ebb. There was barely enough of the precious gases to sustain us for another 12 hours. But would we be alive to know or care? It seemed incredible. At 420 miles I took another reading. "Perry!" I shouted. "Perry, man, she's going down, she's going down. It's 152 degrees again." "Gad," he cried, "what can it mean? Can the earth be cold at the center?" "I do not know, Perry," I answered, "but thank God if I am to die it shall not be by fire. That is all I have feared. I can face the thought of any death but that." Down, down went the mercury until it stood as low as it had 7 miles from the surface of the earth. And then of a sudden realization broke upon us that death was very near. Perry was the first to discover it. I saw him fussing with the valves that regulated the air supply, and at the same time I experienced difficulty in breathing. My head felt dizzy, my limbs heavy. I saw Perry crumple in his seat. He gave himself a shake and sat erect again. Then he turned towards me. "Goodbye, David," he said. "I guess this is the end." And then he smiled and closed his eyes. "Goodbye, Perry, and good luck to you," I answered, smiling back at him. But I fought off that awful lethargy. I was very young. I did not want to die. For an hour I battled against the cruelly enveloping death that surrounded me upon all sides. At first I found that by climbing high into the framework above me I could find more of the precious life-giving elements, and for a while these sustained me. It must have been an hour after Perry had succumbed that I at last came to the realization that I could no longer carry on this unequal struggle against the inevitable. With my last flickering ray of consciousness I turned mechanically towards the distance meter. It stood at exactly 500 miles from the earth's surface, and then of a sudden the huge thing that bore us came to a stop. The rattle of hurtling rock through the hollow jacket ceased. The wild racing of the giant drill betokened that it was running loose in air. And then another truth flashed upon me. The point of the prospector was above us. Slowly it dawned on me that since passing through the ice strata it had been above. We had turned on the ice and sped upwards towards the earth's crust. Thank God, we were safe. I put my nose to the intake pipe through which samples were to have been taken during the passage of the prospector through the earth, and my fondest hopes were realized. A flood of fresh air was pouring into the iron cabin. The reaction left me in a state of collapse, and I lost consciousness. End of chapter 1. Chapter 2 of At the Earth's Core. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. At the Earth's Core by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 2. A Strange World. I was unconscious little more than an instant, for as I lunged forward from the crossbeam to which I had been clinging, and fell with a crash to the floor of the cabin, the shock brought me to myself. My first concern was with Perry. I was horrified at the thought that, upon the very threshold of salvation, he might be dead. Tearing open his shirt, I placed my ear to his breast. I could have cried with relief, his heart was beating quite regularly. At the water tank I wetted my handkerchief, slapping it smartly across his forehead and face several times. In a moment I was rewarded by the raising of his lids. For a time he lay wide-eyed and quite uncomprehending. Then his scattered wits slowly foregathered, and he sat up sniffing the air with an expression of wonderment upon his face. "Why, David," he cried at last, "it's air as sure as I live. Why, what does it mean? Where in the world are we? What has happened?" "It means that we're back at the surface all right, Perry," I cried. "But where I don't know. I haven't opened her up yet. Been too busy reviving you. Lord, man, but you had a close squeak." "You say we're back at the surface, David. How can that be? How long have I been unconscious?" "Not long. We turned in the ice stratum. Don't you recall the sudden whirling of our seats? After that the drill was above you instead of below. We didn't notice it at the time, but I recall it now." "You mean to say that we turned back in the ice stratum, David? That is not possible. The prospector cannot turn unless its nose is deflected from the outside by some external force or resistance. The steering wheel within would have moved in response. The steering wheel has not budged, David, since we started. You know that." I did know it. But here we were with our drill racing in pure air, and copious volumes of it pouring into the cabin. "We couldn't have turned in the ice stratum, Perry, I know as well as you," I replied. "But the fact remains that we did, for here we are this minute at the surface of the earth again, and I am going out to see just where. Better wait till morning, David. It must be midnight now." I glanced at the chronometer. 12:30. We have been out 72 hours, so it must be midnight. Nevertheless, I am going to have a look at the blessed sky that I have given up all hope of ever seeing again." And so saying, I lifted the bars from the inner door and swung it open. There was quite a quantity of loose material in the jacket, and this I had to remove with a shovel to get at the opposite door in the outer shell. In a short time I had removed enough of the earth and rock to the floor of the cabin to expose the door beyond. Perry was directly behind me as I threw it open. The upper half was above the surface of the ground. With an expression of surprise I turned and looked at Perry. It was broad daylight without. "Something seems to have gone wrong, either with our calculations or the chronometer," I said. Perry shook his head. There was a strange expression in his eyes. "Let's have a look beyond that door, David," he cried. Together we stepped out to stand in silent contemplation of a landscape at once weird and beautiful. Before us a low and level shore stretched down to a silent sea. As far as the eye could reach, the surface of the water was dotted with countless tiny isles, some towering barren granite rock, others resplendent in gorgeous trappings of tropical vegetation, myriad starred with the magnificent splendor of vivid blooms. Behind us rose a dark and foreboding wood of giant arborescent ferns, intermingled with the commoner types of a primeval tropical forest. Huge creepers depended in great loops from tree to tree. Dense underbush overgrew a tangled mass of fallen trunks and branches. Upon the outer verge we could see the same splendid coloring of countless blossoms that glorified the islands, but within the dense shadows all seemed dark and gloomy as the grave, and upon all the noonday sun poured its torrid rays out of a cloudless sky. "Where on earth can we be?" I asked, turning to Perry. For some moments the old man did not reply. He stood with bowed head, buried in deep thought. but at last he spoke. "David," he said, "I'm not so sure that we are on earth." "What do you mean?" I cried. "Do you think that we are dead, and that this is heaven?" He smiled, and turning, pointing to the nose of the prospector protruding from the ground at our backs. "But for that, David, I might believe that we were indeed come to the country beyond the Styx. The prospector renders that theory untenable. It certainly could never have gone to heaven. However, I am willing to concede that we actually may be in another world from that which we have always known. If we are not on earth, there is every reason to believe that we may be in it." "We may have quartered through the earth's crust and come out upon some tropical island of the West Indies," I suggested. Again Perry shook his head. "Let us wait and see, David," he replied, "and in the meantime, suppose we do a bit of exploring up and down the coast. We may find a native who can enlighten us." As we walked along the beach, Perry gazed long and earnestly across the water. Evidently he was wrestling with a mighty problem. "David," he said abruptly, "do you perceive anything unusual about the horizon?" As I looked I began to appreciate the reason for the strangeness of the landscape that had haunted me from the first with an elusive suggestion of the bizarre and unnatural. There was no horizon. As far as the eye could reach out, the sea continued, and upon its bosom floated tiny islands, those in the distance reduced to mere specks. But ever beyond them was the sea, until the impression became quite real that one was looking up at the most distant point that the eyes could fathom. The distance was lost in the distance. That was all. There was no clear-cut horizontal line marking the dip of the globe below the line of vision. "A great light is commencing to break on me," continued Perry, taking out his watch. "I believe that I have partially solved the riddle. It is now 2 o'clock. When we emerged from the prospector the sun was directly above us. Where is it now?" I glanced up to find the great orb still motionless in the center of the heaven. And such a sun! I had scarcely noticed it before. Fully thrice the size of the sun I had known throughout my life, and apparently so near that the sight of it carried the conviction that one might almost reach up and touch it. "My God, Perry, where are we?" I exclaimed. "This thing is beginning to get on my nerves." "I think that I may state quite positively, David," he commenced, "that we are " but he got no further. From behind us, in the vicinity of the prospector, there came the most thunderous, awe-inspiring roar that had ever fallen upon my ears. With one accord we turned to discover the author of that fearsome noise. Had I still retained the suspicion that we were on earth, the sight that met my eyes would quite entirely have banished it. Emerging from the forest was a colossal beast which closely resembled a bear. It was fully as large as the largest elephant, and with great forepaws armed with huge claws. Its nose, or snout, depended nearly a foot below its lower jaw, much after the manner of a rudimentary trunk. The giant body was covered by a coat of thick, shaggy hair. Roaring horribly, it came towards us at a ponderous, shuffling trot. I turned to Perry to suggest that it might be wise to seek other surroundings. The idea had evidently occurred to Perry previously, for he was already 100 paces away, and with each second his prodigious bounds increased the distance. I had never guessed what latent speed possibilities the old gentleman possessed. I saw that he was headed toward a little point of the forest which ran out toward the sea not far from where we had been standing, and as the mighty creature, the sight of which had galvanized him into such remarkable action, was forging steadily towards me, I set off after Perry, though at a somewhat more decorous pace. It was evident that the massive beast pursuing us was not built for speed, so all that I considered necessary was to gain the trees sufficiently ahead of it to enable me to climb to the safety of some great branch before it came up. Notwithstanding our danger, I could not help but laugh at Perry's frantic capers as he essayed to gain the safety of the lower branches of the trees he had now reached. The stems were bare for a distance of some 15 feet, at least on those trees which Perry attempted to ascend, for the suggestion of safety carried by the larger of the forest giants had evidently attracted him to them. A dozen times he scrambled up the trunks like a huge cat, only to fall back to the ground once more, and with each failure he cast a horrified glance over his shoulder at the oncoming brute, simultaneously emitting terror-stricken shrieks that awoke the echoes of the grim forest. At length he spied a dangling creeper about the bigness of one's wrist, and when I reached the trees he was racing madly up it, hand over hand. He had almost reached the lowest branch of the tree from which the creeper depended, when the thing parted beneath his weight and he fell sprawlingly at my feet. The misfortune now was no longer amusing, for the beast was already too close to us for comfort. Seizing Perry by the shoulder I dragged him to his feet, and rushing to a smaller tree, one that he could easily encircle with his arms and legs, I boosted him as far up as I could, and then left him to his fate, for a glance over my shoulder revealed the awful beast almost upon me. It was the great size of the thing alone that saved me. Its enormous bulk rendered it too slow upon its feet to cope with the agility of my young muscles, and so I was enabled to dodge out of its way and run completely behind it before its slow wits could direct it in pursuit. The few seconds of grace that this gave me found me safely lodged in the branches of a tree, a few paces from that in which Perry had at last found a haven. Did I say safely lodged? At the time I thought we were quite safe, and so did Perry. He was praying, raising his voice in thanksgiving at our deliverance, and had just completed a sort of paean of gratitude that the thing couldn't climb a tree, when without warning it reared up beneath him on its enormous tail and hind feet, and reached those fearfully armed paws quite to the branch upon which he crouched. The accompanying roar was all but drowned in Perry's screams of fright, and he came near tumbling headlong into the gaping jaws beneath him, so precipitate was his impetuous haste to vacate the dangerous limb. It was with a deep sigh of relief that I saw him gain a higher branch in safety, and then the brute did that which froze us both anew with horror. Grasping the tree's stem with his powerful paws, he dragged down with all the great weight of his huge bulk and all the irresistible force of those mighty muscles. Slowly but surely the stem began to bend towards him. Inch by inch he worked his paws upward as the tree leaned more and more from the perpendicular. Perry clung chattering in the panic of terror. Higher and higher into the bending and swaying tree he clambered. More and more rapidly was the treetop inclining toward the ground. I saw now why the great brute was armed with such enormous paws. The use that he was putting them to was precisely that for which nature had intended them. The sloth-like creature was herbivorous, and to feed that mighty carcass entire trees must be stripped of their foliage. The reason for its attacking us might easily be accounted for on the supposition of an ugly disposition, such as that which the fierce and stupid rhinoceros of Africa possesses. But these were later reflections. At the moment I was too frantic with apprehension on Perry's behalf to consider aught other than a means to save him from the death that loomed so close. Realizing that I could outdistance the clumsy brute in the open, I dropped from my leafy sanctuary, intent only on distracting the thing's attention from Perry long enough to enable the old man to gain the safety of a larger tree. There were many close by, which not even the terrific strength of that titanic monster could bend. As I touched the ground I snatched a broken limb from the tangled mass that matted the jungle-like floor of the forest, and, leaping unnoticed behind the shaggy back, dealt the brute a terrific blow. My plan worked like magic. From the previous slowness of the beast I had been led to look for no such marvelous agility as he now displayed. Releasing his hold upon the tree, he dropped on all fours and at the same time swung his great wicked tail with a force that would have broken every bone in my body had it struck me. But fortunately I had turned to flee at the very instant I had felt my blow land upon the towering back. As it started in pursuit of me, I made the mistake of running along the edge of the forest rather than making for the open beach. In a moment I was knee deep in rotting vegetation, and the awful thing behind me was gaining rapidly as I floundered and fell in my efforts to extricate myself. A fallen log gave me an instant's advantage, for climbing upon it I leaped another few paces farther on, and in this way was able to keep clear of the mush that had carpeted the surrounding ground. But the zigzag course that this necessitated was placing such a heavy handicap upon me that my pursuer was steadily gaining upon me. Suddenly, from behind, I heard a tumult of howls and sharp piercing barks, much the sound that a pack of wolves raises when in full cry. Involuntarily I glanced backwards to discover the origin of this new and menacing note, with the result that I missed my footing and went sprawling once more upon my face in the deep muck. My mammoth enemy was so close by this time that I knew I must feel the weight of one of his terrible paws before I could rise. But to my surprise the blow did not fall upon me. The howling and snapping and barking of the new element which had been infused into the melee now seemed centered quite close behind me, and as I raised myself upon my hands and glanced around, I saw what it was that had distracted the deerith, as afterward I learned the thing is called, from my trail. It was surrounded by a pack of some 100 wolf-like creatures, wild dogs they seemed, that rushed growling and snapping in upon it from all sides, so that they sank their white fangs into the slow brute and were away again before it could reach them with its huge paws or sweeping tail. But these were not all that my startled eyes perceived. Chattering and gibbering through the lower branches of the trees came a company of man-like creatures, evidently urging on the dog pack. They were to all appearances strikingly similar in aspect to the Negro of Africa. Their skins were very black, and their features much like those of the more pronounced Negroid type, except that the head receded more rapidly above the eyes, leaving little or no forehead. Their arms were rather long and their legs shorter in proportion to the torso than in man, and later I noticed that their great toes protruded at right angles from their feet, because of their arboreal habits I presume. Behind them trailed long slender tails, which they had used in climbing quite as much as they did either their hands or feet. I had stumbled to my feet the moment that I discovered that the wolf dogs were holding the deerith at bay. At sight of me several of the savage creatures left off worrying the great brute to come slinking with bared fangs towards me, and as I turned to run towards the trees again to seek safety among the lower branches, I saw a number of man apes leaping and chattering in the foliage of the nearest tree. Between them and the beasts behind me there was little choice, but at least there was a doubt as to the reception these grotesque parodies on humanity would accord me, while there was none as to the fate which awaited me beneath the grinning fangs of my fierce pursuers. And so I raced on towards the trees, intending to pass beneath that which held the man things and take refuge in another farther on. But the wolf dogs were very close behind me, so close that I had despaired of escaping them, when one of the creatures in the tree above swung down head foremost, his tail looped about a great limb, and grasping me beneath my armpits, swung me in safety up among his fellows. There they fell to examining me with the utmost excitement and curiosity. They picked at my clothing, my hair, and my flesh. They turned me about to see if I had a tail, and when they discovered that I was not so equipped, they fell into roars of laughter. Their teeth were very large and white and even, except for the upper canines, which were a trifle longer than the others, protruding just a bit when the mouth was closed. When they had examined me for a few moments, one of them discovered that my clothing was not a part of me, with the result that garment by garment they tore it from me, amidst peals of the wildest laughter. Ape-like they essayed to don the apparel themselves, but their ingenuity was not sufficient to the task, and so they gave it up. In the meantime I had been straining my eyes to catch a glimpse of Perry, but nowhere about could I see him, although the clump of the trees in which he had first taken refuge was in full view. I was much exercised by fear that something had befallen him, and though I called his name aloud several times, there was no response. Tired at last of playing with my clothing, the creatures threw it to the ground, and catching me, one on either side, by an arm, starting off at a most terrifying pace through the tree tops. Never have I experienced such a journey before or since. Even now I oftentimes awake from a deep sleep haunted by the horrid remembrance of that awful experience. From tree to tree the agile creatures sprang like flying squirrels, while the cold sweat stood upon my brow as I glimpsed the depths beneath, into which a single misstep on the part of either of my bearers would hurl me. As they bore me along my mind was occupied with 1,000 bewildering thoughts. What had become of Perry? Would I ever see him again? What were the intentions of these half human things into whose hands I had fallen? Were they inhabitants of the same world into which I had been born? No, it could not be. But yet where else? I had not left that earth, of that I was sure. Still, neither could I reconcile the things which I had seen to a belief that I was still in the world of my birth. With a sigh, I gave up. End of chapter 2.
Chapter 3 of At the Earth's Core. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. At the Earth's Core by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 3 A Change of Masters. We must have traveled several miles through the dark and dismal wood when we came suddenly upon a dense village built high among the branches of the trees. As we approached it, my escort broke into wild shouting, which was immediately answered from within, and a moment later a swarm of creatures of the same strange race as those who had captured me poured out to meet us. Again I was the center of a wildly chattering horde. I was pulled this way and that, pinched, pounded, and thumped until I was black and blue. Yet I do not think that their treatment was dictated by either cruelty or malice. I was a curiosity, a freak, a new plaything, and their childish minds required the added evidence of all their senses to back up the testimony of their eyes. Presently they dragged me within the village, which consisted of several hundred rude shelters of boughs and leaves supported upon the branches of the trees. Between the huts, which sometimes formed crooked streets, were dead branches and the trunks of small trees, which connected the huts upon one tree to those with adjoining trees, the whole network of huts and pathways forming an almost solid flooring a good 50 feet above the ground. I wondered why these agile creatures required connecting bridges between the trees, but later, when I saw the motley aggregation of half-savage beasts which they kept within their village, I realized the necessity for the pathways. There were a number of the same vicious wolf dogs which we had left worrying the deereth, and many goat-like animals, whose distended udders explained the reasons for their presence. My guard halted before one of the huts into which I was pushed. Then two of the creatures squatted down before the entrance, to prevent my escape, doubtless. Though where I should have escaped to, I certainly had not the remotest conception. I had no more than entered the dark shadows of the interior than there fell upon my ears the tone of a familiar voice, in prayer. "Perry!" I cried. "Dear old Perry! Thank the Lord you are safe." "David, can it be possible that you escaped?" And the old man stumbled toward me and threw his arms about me. He had seen me fall before the deereth, and then he had been seized by a number of the ape-like creatures, and borne through the tree-tops to their village. His captors had been as inquisitive as to his strange clothing as had mine, with the same result. As we looked at each other, we could not help but laugh. "With a tail, David," remarked Perry, "you would make a very handsome ape." "Maybe we can borrow a couple," I rejoined. "They seem to be quite the thing this season. I wonder what the creatures intend doing with us, Perry. They don't seem really savage. What do you suppose they can be? You were about to tell me where we are, when that great hairy frigate bore down upon us. Have you really any idea at all?" "Yes, David," he replied. "I know precisely where we are. We have made a magnificent discovery, my boy. We have proved that the earth is hollow. We have passed entirely through its crust to the inner world. Perry, you are mad." "Not at all, David. For 250 miles our prospector bore us through the crust beneath our outer world. At that point it reached the center of gravity of the 500-mile thick crust. Up to that point we had been descending. Direction is, of course, merely relative. Then at the moment that our seats revolved, the thing that made you believe we had turned about and were speeding upward, we passed the center of gravity and, though we did not alter the direction of our progress, yet we were in reality moving upward, toward the surface of the inner world. Does not the strange fauna and flora which we have seen convince you that you are not in the world of your birth? And the horizon, could it present the strange aspects which we both noted, unless we were indeed standing upon the inside of a sphere? But the sun, Perry, I urged. How in the world can the sun shine through 500 miles of solid crust? It is not the sun of the outer world that we have seen here. It is another sun, an entirely different sun, that casts its eternal noonday effulgence upon the face of the inner world. Look at it now, David, if you can see it from the doorway of this hut, and you will see that it is still in the exact center of the heavens. We have been here for many hours, yet it is still noon. And withal it is very simple, David. The earth was once a nebulous mass. It cooled, and as it cooled, it shrank. At length a thin crust of solid matter formed upon its outer surface, a sort of shell. But within it was partially molten matter and highly expanded gases. As it continued to cool, what happened? Centrifugal forces hurled the particles of the nebulous center toward the crust as rapidly as they approached a solid state. You have seen the same principle practically applied in the modern cream separator. Presently there was only a small, superheated core of gaseous matter remaining within a huge vacant interior left by the contraction of the cooling gases. The equal attraction of the solid crust from all directions maintained this luminous core in the exact center of the hollow globe. What remains of it is the sun you saw today, a relatively tiny thing at the exact center of the earth. Equally to every part of this inner world it diffuses its perpetually noonday light and torrid heat. This inner world must have cooled sufficiently to support animal life long ages after life appeared upon the outer crust. But that the same agencies were at work here is evident from the similar forms of both animal and vegetable creation which we have already seen. Take the great beast which attacked us, for example. Unquestionably a counterpart of the megatherium of the post-Pliocene period of the outer crust, whose fossilized skeleton has been found in South America. But the grotesque inhabitants of this forest, I urged, surely they have no counterpart in the earth's history. Who can tell? He rejoined. They may constitute the link between ape and man, all traces of which have been swallowed by the countless convulsions which have racked the outer crust. Or they may be merely the result of evolution along slightly different lines. Either is quite possible. Further speculation was interrupted by the appearance of several of our captors before the entrance of the hut. Two of them entered and dragged us forth. The perilous pathways and the surrounding trees were filled with the black ape-men, their females, and their young. There was not an ornament, a weapon, or a garment among the lot. "Quite low in the scale of creation," commented Perry. "Quite high enough to play the deuce with us, though," I replied. "Now what do you suppose they intend on doing with us?" We were not long in learning. As on the occasion of our trip to the village, we were seized by a couple of the powerful creatures and whirled away through the treetops, while about us and in our wake raced a chattering, jabbering, grinning horde of sleek, black ape things. Twice my bearers missed their footing, and my heart ceased beating, as we plunged towards instant death among the tangled deadwood beneath. But on both occasions those lithe, powerful tails reached out and found sustaining branches, nor did either of the creatures loosen their grasp upon me. In fact, it seemed that the incidents were of no greater moment to them than would be the stubbing of one's toe at a street crossing in the outer world. They but laughed uproariously and sped on with me. For some time they continued through the forest. How long I could not guess, for I was learning, what was later borne very forcefully to my mind, that time ceases to be a factor the moment means for measuring it cease to exist. Our watches were gone, and we were living beneath a stationary sun. Already I was puzzled to compute the period of time which had elapsed, since we broke through the crust of the inner world. It might be hours, or it might be days. Who in the world could tell where it was always noon? By the sun, no time had elapsed. But my judgment told me that we must have been several hours in this strange world. Presently the forest terminated, and we came out upon a level plain. A short distance before us rose a few low rocky hills. Toward these our captors urged us, and after a short time led us through a narrow pass into a tiny circular valley. Here they got down to work, and we were soon convinced that if we were not to die to make a Roman holiday, we were to die for some other purpose. The attitude of our captors altered immediately as they entered the natural arena within the rocky hills. Their laughter ceased. Grim ferocity marked their bestial faces. Bared fangs menaced us. We were placed in the center of the amphitheatre, the 1,000 creatures forming a great ring about us. Then a wolf dog was brought, hyaenodon, Perry called it, and turned loose with us inside the circle. The thing's body was as large as that of a full-grown mastiff, its legs were short and powerful, and its jaws broad and strong. Dark, shaggy hair covered its back and sides, while its breast and belly were quite white. As it slunk toward us, it presented a most formidable aspect, with its upcurled lips baring its mighty fangs. Perry was on his knees praying. I stooped and picked up a small stone. At my movement the beast veered off a bit and commenced circling us. Evidently it had been a target for stones before. The ape things were dancing up and down, urging the brute on with savage cries, until at last, seeing that I did not throw, he charged us. At Andover, and later at Yale, I had pitched on winning ball teams. My speed and control must both have been above ordinary, for I made such a record during my senior year at college that overtures were made to me in behalf of one of the great major league teams. But in the tightest pitch that had ever confronted me in the past, I had never been in such need for control as now. As I wound up for the delivery, I held my nerves and muscles under absolute command, though the grinning jaws were hurtling towards me at terrific speed, and then I let go, with every ounce of my weight and muscle and science in back of that throw. The stone caught the hyaenodon full upon the end of the nose, and sent him bowling over upon his back. At the same instant a chorus of shrieks and howls arose from the circle of spectators, so that for a moment I thought that the upsetting of their champion was the cause. But in this I soon saw I was mistaken. As I looked, the ape things broke in all directions towards the surrounding hills, and then I distinguished the real cause of their perturbation. Behind them, streaming through the pass which leads into the valley, came a swarm of hairy men, gorilla-like creatures armed with spears and hatchets, and bearing long oval shields. Like demons they set upon the ape things, and before them the hyaenodon, which had now regained its senses and its feet, fled howling with fright. Past us swept the pursued and the pursuers, nor did the hairy ones accord us more than a passing glance until the arena had been emptied of its former occupants. Then they returned to us, and one who seemed to have authority among them directed that we be brought with them. When we had passed out of the amphitheatre onto the great plain, we saw a caravan of men and women, human beings like ourselves, and for the first time hope and relief filled my heart, until I could have cried out in the exuberance of my happiness. It is true that they were a half-naked, wild-appearing aggregation, but they at least were fashioned along the same lines as ourselves. There was nothing grotesque or horrible about them as about the other creatures in this strange, weird world. But as we came closer, our hearts sank once more, for we discovered that the poor wretches were chained neck to neck in a long line, and that the guerrilla men were their guards. With little ceremony, Perry and I were chained at the end of the line, and without further ado the interrupted march was resumed. Up to this time the excitement had kept us both up, but now the tiresome monotony of the long march across the sun-baked plain brought on all the agonies consequent to a long denied sleep. On and on we stumbled beneath that hateful noonday sun. If we fell, we were prodded with a sharp point. Our companions in chains did not stumble. They strode along proudly erect. Occasionally they would exchange words with one another in a monosyllabic language. They were a noble-appearing race with well-formed heads and perfect physiques. The men were heavily bearded, tall and muscular. The women, smaller and more gracefully moulded, with great masses of raven hair caught into loose knots upon their heads. The features of both sexes were well proportioned. There was not a face among them that would have been called even plain if judged by earthly standards. They wore no ornaments, but this I later learned was due to the fact that their captors had stripped them of everything of value. As garmenture, the women possessed a single robe of some light-coloured, spotted hide, rather similar in appearance to a leopard's skin. This they wore either supported entirely about the waist by a leathern thong, so that it hung partially below the knee on one side, or possibly looped gracefully across one shoulder. Their feet were shod with skin sandals. The men wore loincloth of the hide of some shaggy beast, long ends of which depended before and behind nearly to the ground. In some instances these ends were finished with the strong talons of the beast from which the hides had been taken. Our guards, whom I have already described as gorilla-like men, were rather lighter in build than a gorilla, but even so they were indeed mighty creatures. Their arms and legs were proportioned more in conformity with human standards, but their entire bodies were covered with shaggy brown hair, and their faces were quite as brutal as those of the few stuffed specimens of the gorilla which I had seen in the museums at home. Their only redeeming feature lay in the development of the head above and back of the ears. In this respect they were not one whit less human than we. They were clothed in a sort of tunic of light cloth which reached to the knees. Beneath this they wore only a loin-cloth of the same material, while their feet were shod with thick hide of some mammoth creature of this inner world. Their arms and necks were encircled by many ornaments of metal, silver predominating, and on their tunics were sewn the heads of tiny reptiles in odd and rather artistic designs. They talked among themselves as they marched along on either side of us, but in a language which I perceived differed from that employed by our fellow prisoners. When they addressed the latter, they used what appeared to be a third language, and which I later learned is a mongrel tongue rather analogous to the pidgin English of the Chinese coolie. How far we marched I have no conception, nor has Perry. Both of us were asleep much of the time for hours before a halt was called. Then we dropped in our tracks. I say for hours, but how may one measure time where time does not exist? When our march commenced the sun stood at zenith. When we halted our shadows still pointed towards nadir. Whether an instant or an eternity of earthly time elapsed, who may say? That march may have occupied 9 years and 11 months of that 10 years that I spent in the inner world, or it may have been accomplished in the fraction of a second. I cannot tell. But this I do know, that since you have told me that 10 years have elapsed since I departed from this earth, I have lost all respect for time. I am commencing to doubt that such a thing exists other than in the weak finite mind of man. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4 of At the Earth's Core. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to find out how you can volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. At the Earth's Core, by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 4. Dian the Beautiful. When our guards arose us from sleep, we were much refreshed. They gave us food, strips of dried meat it was, but it put a new life and strength into us, so that now we too marched with high-held heads, and took noble strides. At least I did, for I was young and proud, but poor Perry hated walking. On earth I had often seen him call a cab to travel a square. He was paying for it now, and his old legs wobbled so that I put my arm about him and half carried him through the balance of those frightful marches. The country began to change at last, and we wound up out of the level plain through mighty mountains of virgin granite. The tropical verdure of the lowlands was replaced by hardier vegetation, but even here the effects of constant heat and light were apparent in the immensity of the trees and the profusion of foliage and blooms. Crystal streams roared through the rocky channels, fed by the perpetual snows which we could see far above us. Above the snow-capped heights hung masses of heavy clouds. It was these, Perry explained, which evidently served the double purpose of replenishing the melting snows, and protecting them from the direct rays of the sun. By this time we had picked up a smattering of the bastard language in which our guards addressed us, as well as making good headway in the rather charming tongue of our co-captives. Directly ahead of me, in the chain gang, was a young woman. 3 feet of chain linked us together in a forced companionship which I, at least, soon rejoiced in. For I found her a willing teacher, and from her I learned the language of her tribe, and much of the life and customs of the inner world, at least that part of it with which she was familiar. She told me that she was called Dian the Beautiful, and that she belonged to the tribe of Amoz, which dwells in the cliffs above the Darel Az, or Shallow Sea. "How came you here?" I asked her. "I was running away from Jubal, the ugly one," she answered, as though that was explanation quite sufficient. "Who is Jubal the ugly one?" I asked, "and why did you run away from him?" She looked at me in surprise. "Why does a woman run away from a man?" she answered my question with another. "They do not, where I come from," I replied. "Sometimes they run after them." But she could not understand, nor could I get her to grasp the fact that I was of another world. She was quite as positive that creation was originated solely to produce her own kind, and the world she lived in, as are many of the outer world. "But Jubal," I insisted, "tell me about him, and why you ran away to be chained by the neck and scourged across the face of a world." "Jubal the ugly one placed his trophy before my father's house. It was the head of a mighty Tandor. It remained there, and no greater trophy was placed beside it. So I knew that Jubal the ugly one would come and take me as his mate. None other so powerful wished me, or they would have slain a mightier beast and thus have won me from Jubal. My father is not a mighty hunter. Once he was, but a Sadak tossed him, and never again had he the full use of his right arm. My brother Dekor, the strong one, had gone to the land of Sari to steal a mate for himself. Thus there was none, father, brother, or lover, to save me from Jubal the ugly one, and I ran away and hid among the hills that skirt the land of Amoz. And there these Sagoths found me and made me captive." "What will they do with you?" I asked. "Where are they taking us?" Again she looked her incredulity. "I can almost believe that you are of another world," she said, "for otherwise such ignorance were inexplicable. Do you really mean that you do not know that the Sagoths are the creatures of the Mahars, the mighty Mahars who think they own Pellucidar, and all that walks or grows upon its surface, or creeps or burrows beneath, or swims within its lakes and oceans, or flies through its air? Next you will be telling me that you've never before heard of the Mahars." I was loath to do it, and further incur her scorn. But there was no alternative if I were to absorb knowledge, so I made a clean breast of my pitiful ignorance as to the mighty Mahars. She was shocked. But she did her very best to enlighten me, though much that she said was as Greek would have been to her. She described the mayors largely by comparison. In this way they were like unto thipdars, in that to the hairless Lydie. About all I gleaned of them was that they were quite hideous, had wings and webbed feet, lived in cities built beneath the ground, could swim under water for great distances, and were very, very wise. The Sagoths were their weapons of offence and defence, and the races like herself were their hands and feet. They were the slaves and servants who did all the manual labour. The mayors were the heads, the brains of the inner world. I longed to see this wondrous race of supermen. Perry learned the language with me. When we halted, as we occasionally did, though sometimes the halts seemed ages apart, he would join in the conversation, as would Ghak the hairy one, he who was chained just ahead of Dian the beautiful. Ahead of Ghak was Hooja the sly one. He too entered the conversation occasionally. Most of his remarks were directed towards Dian the beautiful. It didn't take half an eye to see that he had developed a bad case. But the girl appeared totally oblivious to his thinly veiled advances. Did I say thinly veiled? There is a race of men in New Zealand or Australia, I have forgotten which, who indicate their preference for the lady of their affections by banging her over the head with a bludgeon. By comparison with this method, Hooja's love-making might be called thinly veiled. At first it caused me to blush violently, although I have seen several old years out at Rector's, and in other less fashionable places off Broadway, and in Vienna and Hamburg. But that girl, she was magnificent. It was easy to see that she considered herself as entirely above and apart from her present surroundings and company. She talked with me and with Perry, and with the taciturn Ghak because we were respectful. But she couldn't even see Hooja the Sly One, much less hear him, and that made him furious. He tried to get one of the Sagoths to move the girl up ahead of him in the slave gang, but the fellow only poked him with his spear and told him that he had selected the girl for his own property, that he would buy her from the Mahars as soon as they reached Phutra. Phutra, it seemed, was the city of our destination. After passing over the first chain of the mountains, we skirted a salt sea, upon whose bosom swam countless horrid things. Seal-like creatures there were, with long necks stretching 10 or more feet above their enormous bodies, and whose snake heads were split with gaping mouths, bristling with countless fangs. There were huge tortoises, too, paddling about among these other reptiles, which Perry said were plesiosaurs of the lias. I didn't question his veracity. They might have been most anything. Dian told me they were tandorazes, or tandors of the sea, and that the other and more fearsome reptiles, which occasionally rose from the deep to do battle with them, were asdiriths, or sea diriths. Perry called them ichthyosaurs. They resembled a whale with the head of an alligator. I had forgotten what little geology I had studied at school. About all that remained was an impression of horror that the illustrations of restored prehistoric monsters had made upon me, and a well-defined belief that any man with a pig's shank and a vivid imagination could restore most any sort of Paleolithic monster he saw fit, and take rank as a first-class paleontologist. But when I saw these sleek shiny carcasses shimmering in the sunlight as they emerged from the ocean, shaking their giant heads, when I saw the waters roll from their sinuous bodies in miniature waterfalls as they glided hither and thither, now upon the surface, now half submerged, as I saw them meet open-mouthed, hissing and snorting, in their titanic and interminable warring, I realized how futile is man's poor, weak imagination by comparison with nature's incredible genius. And Perry, he was absolutely flabbergasted. He said so himself. "David," he remarked, after we had marched for a long time beside that awful sea, "David, I used to teach geology, and I thought that I believed what I taught. But now I see that I did not believe it, that it is impossible for man to believe such things as these unless he sees them with his own eyes. We take things for granted, perhaps because we are told them over and over again, and have no way of disproving them, like religions, for example. But we don't believe them, we only think we do. If you ever get back to the outer world, you will find that the geologists and paleontologists will be the first to set you down a liar, for they know that no such creatures as they restore ever existed. It is all right to imagine them as existing in an equally imaginary epoch, but now proof." At the next halt, Hooja the Sly One managed to find enough slack chain to permit him to worm himself back quite close to Dian. We were all standing, and as he edged near the girl, she turned her back upon him in such a truly earthly feminine manner that I could scarce repress a smile. But it was a short-lived smile, for on the instant the Sly One's hand fell upon the girl's bare arm, jerking her roughly towards him. I was not then familiar with the customs or social ethics which prevailed within Pellucidar, but even so I did not need the appealing look to which the girl shot to me from her magnificent eyes to influence my subsequent act. What the Sly One's intention was I paused not to inquire, but instead, before he could lay hold of her with his other hand, I placed a right to the point of his jaw that felled him in his tracks. A roar of approval went up from those of the other prisoners and the Sagoths who had witnessed the brief drama, not, as I later learned, because I had championed the girl, but for the neat and to them astounding method by which I had bested Hooja. And the girl! At first she looked at me with wide, wondering eyes, and then she dropped her head, her face half averted, and a delicate flush suffused her cheeks. For a moment she stood thus in silence, and then her head went high, and she turned her back upon me as she had upon Hooja. Some of the prisoners laughed, and I saw the face of Ghak the hairy one go very black as he looked at me searchingly, and what I could see of Dian's cheek went suddenly from red to white. Immediately after, we resumed the march, and though I realized that in some way I had offended Dian the Beautiful, I could not prevail upon her to talk with me that I might learn wherein I had erred. In fact, I might quite as well have been addressing a sphinx, for all the attention I got. At last my own foolish pride stepped in and prevented my making any further attempts, and thus a companionship that, without my realizing it, had come to mean a great deal to me, was cut off. Hooja did not renew his advances toward the girl, nor did he again venture near me. Again the weary and apparently interminable marching became a perfect nightmare of horrors to me. The more firmly fixed became the realization that the girl's friendship had meant so much to me, the more I came to miss it, and the more impregnable the barrier of silly pride. But I was very young, and would not ask Ghak for the explanation which I was sure he could give, and that might have made everything all right again. On the march, or during halts, Dian refused consistently to notice me. When her eyes wandered in my direction, she looked either over my head or directly through me. At last I became desperate, and determined to swallow my self-esteem, and again beg her to tell me how I had offended, and how I might make reparation. I made up my mind that I should do this at the next halt. We were approaching another range of mountains at the time, and when we reached them, instead of winding across them through some high-flung pass, we entered a mighty natural tunnel, a series of labyrinthian grottos, dark as Erebus. The guards had no torches or lights of any description. In fact, we had seen no artificial light or sign of fire since we had entered Pellucidar. In a land of perpetual noon there is no need of light above ground. Yet I marveled that they had no means of lighting their way through these dark subterranean passages. So we crept along at a snail's pace, with much stumbling and falling, the guards keeping up a sing-song chant ahead of us, interspersed with certain high notes which I found always indicated rough places and turns. Halts were now more frequent, but I did not wish to speak to Diana until I could see from the expression of her face how she was receiving my apologies. At last a faint glow ahead forewarned us of the end of the tunnel, for which I for one was devoutly thankful. Then at a sudden turn we emerged into the full light of the noonday sun. But with it came a sudden realization of what meant to me a real catastrophe. Diane was gone, and with her a half-dozen other prisoners. The guards saw it too, and the ferocity of their rage was terrible to behold. Their awesome bestial faces were contorted in the most diabolical expressions, as they accused each other of responsibility for the loss. Finally they fell upon us, beating us with their spear shafts and hatchets. They had already killed 2 near the head of the line, and were like to have finished the balance of us when their leader finally put a stop to the brutal slaughter. Never in all my life had I witnessed a more horrible exhibition of bestial rage. I thanked God that Diane had not been one of those left to endure it. Of the 12 prisoners who had been chained ahead of me, each alternate one had been freed, commencing with Diane. Hooja was gone, Ghak remained. What could it mean? How had it been accomplished? The commander of the guards was investigating. Soon he discovered that the rude locks which had held the neckbands in place had been deftly picked. "Hooja, the sly one," murmured Ghak, who was now next to me in line. "He has taken the girl that you would not have," he continued, glancing at me. "That I would not have?" I cried. "What do you mean?" He looked at me closely for a moment. "I have doubted your story that you are from another world," he said at last, "but yet upon no other ground could your ignorance of the ways of Pellucidar be explained. Do you really mean that you do not know that you have offended the beautiful one, and how?" "I do not know, Ghak," I replied. "Then I shall tell you. When a man of Pellucidar intervenes between another man and the woman the other man would have, the woman belongs to the victor. Diane the Beautiful belongs to you. You should have claimed her or released her. Had you taken her hand, it would have indicated your desire to make her your mate; and had you raised her hand above her head and then dropped it, it would have meant that you did not wish her for your mate, and that you released her from all obligations to you. By doing neither, you have put upon her the greatest affront that any man may put upon a woman. Now she is your slave. No man will take her as a mate, or may take her honorably, until he shall have overcome you in combat. And men do not choose slave women as their mates, at least not the men of Pellucidar." "I did not know, Ghak," I cried. "I did not know. Not for all Pellucidar would I have harmed Diane the Beautiful by word or look or act of mine. I do not want her as my slave. I do not want her as my—" But here I stopped. The vision of that sweet, innocent face floated before me amidst the soft mists of imagination, and where I had on the second believed that I clung only to the memory of a gentle friendship I had lost, yet now it seemed that it would have been disloyalty to her to have said that I did not want Diane the Beautiful as my mate. I have not thought of her except as a welcome friend in a strange, cruel world. Even now I did not think that I loved her. I believe Ghak must have read the truth more in my expression than in my words, for presently he laid his hand upon my shoulder. "Man of another world," he said, "I believe you. Lips may lie, but when the heart speaks through the eyes it tells only the truth. Your heart has spoken to me. I know now that you meant no affront to Diane the Beautiful. She is not of my tribe, but her mother is my sister. She does not know it. Her mother was stolen by Diane's father, who came with others from the tribe of Amoz, to battle with us for our women, the most beautiful women of Pellucidar. Then was her father the king of Amoz, and her mother was daughter of the king of Sari, to whose power I, his son, have succeeded. Diane is the daughter of kings, though her father is no longer king since the Sadok tossed him and Jubal the Ugly One wrested his kingship from him. Because of her lineage, the wrong you did her was greatly magnified in the eyes of all who saw it. She will never forgive you. I asked Ghak if there was not some way in which I could release the girl from the bondage and ignominy I had unwittingly placed upon her. "If ever you find her, yes," he answered. "Merely to raise your hand above her head and drop it in the presence of others is sufficient to release her. But how may you ever find her, you who are doomed to a life of slavery yourself in the buried city of Phutra?" "Is there no escape?" I asked. "Hooja the Sly One escaped and took the others with him," replied Ghak. "But there are no more dark places on the way to Phutra, and once there it is not so easy. The Mahars are very wise. Even if one escaped from Phutra, there are the Thipdars. They would find you, and then—" The hairy one shuddered. "No, you will never escape the Mahars." It was a cheerful prospect. I asked Perry what he thought about it, but he only shrugged his shoulders and continued a long-winded prayer he had been at for some time. He was wont to say that the only redeeming feature of our captivity was the ample time it gave him for the improvisation of prayers. It was becoming an obsession with him. The Sagoths had begun to take notice of his habit of declaiming throughout entire marches. One of them asked him what he was saying, to whom he was talking. The question gave me an idea, so I answered quickly before Perry could say anything. "Do not interrupt him," I said. "He is a very holy man in the world from which we come. He is speaking to spirits which you cannot see. Do not interrupt him, or they will spring out of the air upon you and rend you limb from limb, like that," and I jumped towards the great brute with a loud "boo" that sent him stumbling backward. I took a long chance, I realized, but if we could make any capital out of Perry's harmless mania, I wanted to make it while the making was prime. It worked splendidly. The Sagoths treated us both with marked respect during the balance of our journey, and then passed the word along to their masters, the Mahars. 2 marches after this episode, we came to the city of Phutra. The entrance to it was marked by 2 lofty towers of granite, which guarded a flight of steps leading to the buried city. Sagoths were on guard here, as well as at 100 or more other towers scattered about over a large plain. End of chapter 4.
Chapter 5 of At the Earth's Core. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dave Chase. At the Earth's Core by Edgar Rice Burroughs. Chapter 5. Slaves. As we descended the broad staircase which led to the main avenue of Phutra, I caught my first sight of the dominant race of the inner world. Involuntarily I shrank back as one of the creatures approached to inspect us. A more hideous thing it would be impossible to imagine. The all-powerful Mahars of Pellucidar are great reptiles, some 6 or 8 feet in length, with long narrow heads and great round eyes. Their beak-like mouths are lined with sharp white fangs, and the backs of their huge lizard bodies are serrated into bony ridges from their necks to the end of their long tails. Their feet are equipped with 3 webbed toes, while from the 4 feet membranous wings, which are attached to their bodies just in front of the hind legs, protrude at an angle of 45 degrees toward the rear, ending in sharp points several feet above their bodies. I glanced at Perry as the thing passed me to inspect him. The old man was gazing at the hard creatures with wide, astonished eyes. When it passed on, he turned to me. "A Rhamphorhynchus of the Mesolithic, David," he said, "but gad, how enormous! The largest remains we've ever discovered have never indicated a size greater than that attained by an ordinary crow." As we continued on through the main avenue of Phutra, we saw many thousand of the creatures coming and going upon their daily duties. They paid but little attention to us. Phutra is laid out underground with a regularity that indicates remarkable engineering skill. It is hewn from solid limestone strata. The streets are broad and of a uniform height of 20 feet. At intervals, tubes pierce the roof of this underground city, and by means of lenses and reflectors transmit the sunlight softened and diffused to dispel what would otherwise be Cimmerian darkness. In like manner air is introduced. Perry and I were taken, with Ghak, to a large public building, where one of the Sagoths who had formed our guard explained to a Maharan official the circumstances surrounding our capture. The method of communication between these two was remarkable in that no spoken words were exchanged. They employed a species of sign language. As I was to learn later, the Mahars have no ears, not any spoken language. Among themselves they communicate by means of what Perry says must be a sixth sense which is cognizant of a fourth dimension. I never did quite grasp him, though he endeavored to explain it to me upon numerous occasions. I suggested telepathy, but he said no, that it was not telepathy, since they could only communicate when in each other's presence, nor could they talk with the Sagoths or the other inhabitants of Pellucidar by the same method they used to converse with one another. "What they do," said Perry, "is to project their thoughts into the fourth dimension, when they become appreciable to the sixth sense of their listener. Do I make myself quite clear?" "You do not, Perry," I replied. He shook his head in despair and returned to his work. They had set us to carrying a great accumulation of Maharan literature from one apartment to another, and there arranging it upon shelves. I suggested to Perry that we were in the public library of Phutra, but later, as he commenced to discover the key to their written language, he assured me that we were handling the ancient archives of the race. During this period my thoughts were continually upon Diane the Beautiful. I was, of course, glad that she had escaped the Mahars, and the fate that had been suggested by the Sagoth, who had threatened to purchase her upon our arrival at Phutra. I often wondered if the little party of fugitives had been overtaken by the guards who had returned to search for them. Sometimes I was not so sure, but I should have been more contented to know that Diane was here in Phutra than to think of her at the mercy of Hooja the Sly One. Ghak, Perry, and I often talked together of possible escape, but the Saurian was so steeped in his lifelong belief that no one could escape from the Mahars except by a miracle, that he was not much aid to us. His attitude was of one who waits for the miracle to come to him. At my suggestion, Perry and I fashioned some swords of scraps of iron, which we discovered among some rubbish in the cells where we slept, for we were permitted almost unrestrained freedom of action within the limits of the building to which we had been assigned. So great were the number of slaves who waited upon the inhabitants of Phutra that none of us was apt to be overburdened with work, nor were our masters unkind to us. We hid our new weapons beneath the skins which formed our beds, and then Perry conceived the idea of making bows and arrows, weapons apparently unknown within Pellucidar. Next came shields, but these I found it easier to steal from the walls of the outer guard-room of the building. We had completed these arrangements for our protection after leaving Phutra, when the Sagoths who had been sent to recapture the escaped prisoners returned with 4 of them, of whom Hooja was one. Diane and 2 others had eluded them. It so happened that Hooja was confined in the same building with us. He told Ghak that he had not seen Diane or the others after releasing them within the dark grotto. What had become of them he had not the faintest conception. They might be wandering yet, lost within the labyrinthine tunnel, if not dead from starvation. I was now still further apprehensive as to the fate of Diane, and at this time I imagine came the first realization that my affection for the girl might be prompted by more than friendship. During my waking hours she was constantly the subject of my thoughts, and when I slept her dear face haunted my dreams. More than ever I was determined to escape the Mahars. "Perry," I confided to the old man, "if I have to search every inch of this diminutive world, I'm going to find Diane the Beautiful and right the wrong that I unintentionally did her." That was the excuse I made for Perry's benefit. "Diminutive world," he scoffed. "You don't know what you're talking about, my boy." And then he showed me a map of Pellucidar which he had recently discovered among the manuscript he was arranging. "Look," he cried, pointing to it, "this is evidently water, and all this land. Do you notice the general configuration of the 2 areas? Where the oceans are upon the outer crust is land here. These relatively small areas of ocean follow the general lines of the continents of the outer world. We know that the crust of the globe is 500 miles in thickness. Then the inside diameter of Pellucidar must be 7,000 miles, and the superficial area 165,480,000 square miles. 3/4 of this is land. Think of it! A land area of 124,100,000 110,000 square miles. Our own world contains but 53 million square miles of land, the balance of its surface being covered by water. Just as we often compare nations by their relative land areas, so if we compare these two worlds in the same way, we have the strange anomaly of a larger world within a smaller one. Where within vast Pellucidar would you search for your Diane? Without stars or moon or changing sun, how could you find her, even though you knew where she might be found? The proposition was a corker. It quite took my breath away, but I found that it left me all the more determined to attempt it. If Ghak will accompany us, we may be able to do it, I suggested. Perry and I sought him out and put the question straight to him. Ghak, I said, we are determined to escape from this bondage. Will you accompany us? They will set the Thipdars upon us, he said, and then we shall be killed. But, he hesitated, I would take the chance if I thought that I might possibly escape and return to my own people. Could you find your way back to your own land? Asked Perry. And could you aid David in his search for Diane? Yes. But how, persisted Perry, could you travel to strange country without heavenly bodies or a compass to guide you? Ghak didn't know what Perry meant by heavenly bodies or a compass, but he assured us that you might blindfold any man of Pellucidar and carry him to the farthest corner of the world, yet he would be able to come directly to his own home again by the shortest route. He seemed surprised to think that we found anything wonderful in it. Perry said it must be some sort of homing instinct, such as is possessed by certain breeds of earthly pigeons. I didn't know, of course, but it gave me an idea. Then Diane could have found her way directly to her own people? I asked. Surely, replied Ghak, unless some mighty beast of prey killed her. I was for making the attempted escape at once, but both Perry and Ghak counseled waiting for some propitious accident which would ensure us some small degree of success. I didn't see what accident could befall a whole community in a land of perpetual daylight, where the inhabitants had no fixed habits of sleep. Why, I am sure that some of the heirs never sleep, while others may, at long intervals, crawl into the dark recesses beneath their dwellings and curl up in protracted slumber. Perry says that if a heir stays awake for 3 years, he will make up all his lost sleep in a long year's snooze. That may all be true, but I never saw but 3 of them asleep. It was the sight of these 3 that gave me a suggestion for our means of escape. I had been searching out far below the levels that we slaves were supposed to frequent, possibly 50 feet beneath the main floor of the building, among a network of corridors and apartments, when I came suddenly upon 3 heirs curled up upon a bed of skins. At first I thought they were dead, but later their regular breathing convinced me of my error. Like a flash the thought came to me of the marvelous opportunity these sleeping reptiles offered as a means of eluding the watchfulness of our captors and the Sagoth guards. Hastening back to Perry, where he pored over a musty pile of, to me, meaningless hieroglyphics, I explained my plan to him. To my surprise, he was horrified. "It would be murder, David," he cried. "Murder? To kill a reptilian monster?" I asked in astonishment. "Here they are not monsters, David," he replied. "Here they are the dominant race. We are the monsters, the lower orders. In Pellucidar evolution has progressed along different lines than upon the outer earth. These terrible convulsions of nature time and time again wiped out the existing species. But for this fact some monster of the Saurozoic epoch might rule today upon our own world. We see here what might well have occurred in our own history had conditions been what they have been here. Life within Pellucidar is far younger than upon the outer crust. Here man has but reached a stage analogous to the Stone Age of our own world's history, but for countless millions of years these reptiles have been progressing. Possibly it is the sixth sense, which I am sure they possess, that has given them an advantage over the other and more frightfully armed of their fellows, but this we may never know. They look upon us as we look upon the beasts of our fields, and I learn from their written records that other races of heirs feed upon men. They keep them in great droves, as we keep cattle. They breed them most carefully, and when they are quite fat, they kill and eat them." I shuddered. "What is there horrible about it, David?" the old man asked. "They understand us no better than we understand the lower animals of our own world. Why, I have come across here very learned discussions of the questions as to whether Gilaks, that is men, have any means of communication. One writer claims that we do not even reason, that our every act is mechanical or instinctive. The dominant race of Pellucidar, David, have not yet learned that men converse among themselves or reason. Because we do not converse as they do, it is beyond them to imagine that we converse at all. It is thus that we reason in relation to the brutes of our own world. They know that the Sagas have a spoken language, but they cannot comprehend it, or how it manifests itself, since they have no auditory apparatus. They believe that the motions of the lips alone convey the meaning. That the Sagas can communicate with us is incomprehensible to them. Yes, David, he concluded, it would entail murder to carry out your plan. Very well then, Perry, I replied. I shall become a murderer. He got me to go over the plan again most carefully, and for some reason which was not at the time clear to me, insisted upon a very careful description of the apartments and corridors I had just explored. I wonder, David, he said at length, as you are determined to carry out your wild scheme, if we could not accomplish something of very real and lasting benefit for the human race of Pellucidar at the same time. Listen, I have learned much of a most surprising nature from these archives of the heirs. That you may not appreciate my plan, I shall briefly outline the history of the race. Once the males were all-powerful, but ages ago the females, little by little, assumed the mastery. For other ages no noticeable change took place in the race of heirs. It continued to progress under the intelligent and beneficent rule of the ladies. Science took vast strides. This was especially true of the sciences which we know as biology and eugenics. Finally, a certain female scientist announced the fact that she had discovered a method whereby eggs might be fertilized by chemical means after they were laid. All true reptiles, you know, are hatched from eggs. What happened? Immediately the necessity for males ceased to exist. The race was no longer dependent upon them. More ages elapsed until at the present time we find a race consisting exclusively of females. But here is the point. The secret of this chemical formula is kept by a single race of heirs. It is in the city of Phutra, and unless I am greatly in error, I judge from your description of the vaults through which you passed today that it lies hidden in the cellar of this building. For two reasons they hide it away and guard it jealously. First, because upon it depends the very life of the race of the heirs, and second, owing to the fact that when it was public property, as at first so many were experimenting with it, that the danger of overpopulation became very grave. David, if we can escape, and at the same time take with us this great secret, what will we not have accomplished for the human race within Pellucidar? The very thought of it fairly overpowered me. Why, we too would be the means of placing the men of the inner world in their rightful place among created things. Only the Sagas would then stand between them and absolute supremacy, and I was not quite sure but that the Sagas owed all their power to the greater intelligence of the heirs. I could not believe that these gorilla-like beasts were the mental superiors of the human race of Pellucidar. "Why, Perry," I exclaimed, "you and I may reclaim a whole world. Together we can lead the races of men out of the darkness of ignorance into the light of advancement and civilization. At one step we may carry them from the age of stone to the 20th century. It's marvelous, absolutely marvelous, just to think about it." "David," said the old man, "I believe that God sent us here for just that purpose. It shall be my life work to teach them His word, to lead them into the light of His mercy while we are training their hearts and hands in the ways of culture and civilization." "You are right, Perry," I said, "and while you are teaching them to pray, I'll be teaching them to fight, and between us we'll make a race of men that will be an honor to us both." Ghak had entered the apartment some time before we concluded our conversation, and now he wanted to know what we were so excited about. Perry thought we had best not tell him too much, and so I only explained that I had a plan for escape. When I had outlined it to him, he seemed about as horror-struck as Perry had been, but for a different reason. The hairy one only considered the horrible fate that would be ours were we discovered. But at last I prevailed upon him to accept my plan as the only feasible one, and when I had assured him that I would take all the responsibility for it were we captured, he accorded a reluctant assent. End of chapter 5.